This video is sponsored by Proton Mail. It's been a while since I made my last video about the Ukraine war, but recent events have prompted me to do a new one. With Republicans back in power in the US, the equation has changed quite a bit. Or did it? What are the outlooks for Ukraine in this war, going on for 3.5 years at this point? Will Russia ever run out of hardware and men? These are some of the questions I'll be trying to answer, in a neat, organized presentation style. First, let's take a look at the current situation on the front line. Chances are you haven't heard news of large battlefield movements or the taking or retaking of cities. And that's because not much has been happening on the front line lately, at least not much new. So far, in 2025, Russia has managed to take over a couple thousand square kilometers, distributed mostly evenly along the massive front line. While that does sound like a lot, remember that the internationally recognized territories of Ukraine make up around 603,000 square kilometers. So at this rate, Russia will conquer the full territory of Ukraine in about 2 centuries. A further point to consider here is that Russia is pressing forward at such a glacial pace in areas that are mostly flat and open. No mountains, no block-by-block urban warfare, just flat, open fields where current advances are measured in villages and tree lines. Additionally, the more time passes, the more time Ukrainians will have to build and strengthen defensive lines. So if Russia can barely advance now on relatively easy terrain, how would they fare on the difficult terrain? But let's imagine a scenario where somehow Ukrainian defensive lines collapse in the east and Russia takes over the entire territory. Well, congratulations, now you only need to take over large cities like Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, Dnipro and Poltava, in addition to having to cross a large river and a swamp area. Or you can try pushing forward south of Kharkiv, by which you'll have shrunk the front line to half, allowing Ukrainians to concentrate their defenses. Then, if you manage to break through those defenses, your reward will be a block-by-block urban warfare in multiple cities with pre-war sizes ranging between 300,000 and 1.4 million. And once you're done with that, you'll have taken over 1/3 of Ukraine. But could Russia somehow get a second wind, accumulating men and hardware, and just go for it after all? With that, let's talk about the Russian and Ukrainian capacity to sustain the war. Though much of the information here is a state secret, we are still able to get a rough picture of what's happening. But just like how it's important to keep sensitive military data secure, you should do the same with your private correspondence. This is where today's sponsor, Proton Mail, comes in. Proton Mail is a privacy-focused, end-to-end encrypted email service made to keep your personal data safe from unauthorized eyes. It is now as relevant as ever as governments around the world are getting increasingly comfortable with surveilling their own citizens. This is also a reminder that the Trump admin controls both the NSA and the FBI, and a law called Section 702 allowing them to surveil even foreigners. But they also use that same law to spy on US citizens, who would have thought. Needless to say, the rule of law is increasingly an afterthought here, so it's best to keep your private correspondence private. And Proton Mail was made for exactly that, both for personal and business use. I also use it as my personal private email. If you already have an email address at one of the big providers like Gmail, switching is easy, as you can set up Proton's auto-forwarding feature in just a few clicks. Go to proton.me/adamsomething to get started with Proton Mail for free. Their service is always free, with optional paid subscription plans for additional features and benefits. That's proton.me/adamsomething. Thank you for checking out Proton Mail. When it comes to the side's ability to sustain the war, we must take into account 2 factors, hardware and manpower, with the note that both have to be available for a military to function. You can have 1 million men, but if you can't equip them, you can't really use them. Or you can have 1 million tanks, but if you can't man them, they're just inert hunks of metal. In terms of manpower, Ukraine still has significant resources. The draft age has not been lowered below 25, meaning if the need arises, they can train and equip hundreds of thousands more. They want to avoid this for now, since it's not a great idea to lose your youngest adult generation in a war, especially in a country with serious population decline. Another factor helping Ukraine here is that they are on the defensive, which generally means less casualties, in addition to fighting a war for their existence, so if push comes to shove, a lot more people would pick up arms if need be. Also, Ukraine's heavy reliance on FPV drones does seem to compensate for manpower shortages, since now if you want to clear a trench, a building, or if you want to stop advancing Russian infantry, instead of sending out 30 dudes, you can just fly a few dozen FPV drones at them from a distance. So all in all, the Ukrainian manpower situation is not great, but not terrible either. Russia, on the other hand, is increasingly in a difficult situation. In September 2022, Putin attempted a partial mobilization, which resulted in hundreds of thousands fleeing the country, and the situation threatened with an actual public backlash. Russian society is thoroughly atomized and low trust, enough so that most people don't mind the meat grinder in Ukraine swallowing more and more of their fellow countrymen. However, the moment they get involved personally, against their will, like through mobilization, that seems to constitute the red line for most. Therefore, therefore Putin is keen on exhausting every single other option before even considering another mobilization. And so their methods have been very creative. The army recruited in prisons, homeless shelters, impoverished regions with high joblessness, and has been trying hard to push conscripts into the battlefield despite it being illegal. The new method, according to the Systema research project, is to recruit people as volunteers, basically as mercenaries whose contracts do not automatically renew at the end of a year's service or less, as opposed to regular military contracts that automatically renew until the end of the war. So the non-renewing contract is used to lure people in who are on the fence, who are enticed by the pay but are turned off by the indefinite contract. But this also has a side effect. Apparently, such soldiers are treated as second-rate. If a Ukrainian defensive position needs to be stormed in a so-called meat assault, guess who's going in first? And in one of such mercenary programs, the one that promises the most flexibility, you basically operate in a legal gray zone and do not have access to any support like rehabilitation or a pension after your service. This, of course, puts a heavy toll on your population, leaving thousands of working-age men by the roadside, disabled and traumatized. But for Russia, this seems to be the high cost of manning their formations without a mobilization. So both Russia and Ukraine are holding on for now in terms of manpower and are trying not to cross their red lines, mobilizing below the age of 25 for Ukraine and a general mobilization for Russia. If both were to happen though, Russia would be at a far greater risk of backlash, while Ukraine is kept relatively safe from it due to fighting a defensive war. With that in mind, let's take a look at hardware. Russia has been churning out missiles and drones at a very high rate and has launched about 20,000 at Ukraine this year. In terms of surface hardware, however, the situation is not looking great. What we're mostly looking for here are tanks and other AFVs. And according to Covert Cabal's numbers based on satellite images, Russian tanks at storage bases are down from about 6,100 in 2022 to about half, 3,300 in 2024. Meanwhile, AFVs are down from around 7,400 to about 4,000. So both categories pretty much halved. What Covert Cabal additionally points out, however, is if we subtract vehicles in a terrible state, so ones that look like scrap even from orbit, the number of tanks and AFVs in storage both crater to about 1,000 each. And this is after adjusting for vehicles that might have been unseen inside garages. So it's not looking good for Russia, like, at all. So when will they run out, one might ask? Well, in warfare there is no such thing as running out, so to speak, because Russia also produces new vehicles, sometimes by using the racks at storage bases. It's much slower and more work-intensive than just reactivation, but they are doing it. And there is also new production from scratch, like T-90M tanks, which research by the conflict intelligence team puts it around 300 per year. But since Russia has been losing about 1,000 tanks per year, that just won't cut it seems. So there will always be a flow of vehicles to the front lines, only when the storages empty out, this flow will be much smaller. There will likely never come a point where we stop seeing Russian armored vehicles on the battlefield, but their numbers will gradually decline over time as storages empty out. That means Russia will not be able to fight at the same pace as it did so far, potentially giving Ukrainians opportunities to hit back. With that, what about Ukraine? In terms of AFVs and tanks, they are doing decently. Of course, they could always use more, but they have already gotten plenty of hardware with a lot still in the pipeline. According to Oryx, the confirmed minimum number of deliveries are 81 aircraft, 71 helicopters, 914 tanks, 101 AFVs, 1,157 IFVs, 3,856 APCs, 1,540 MRAPs, 6,870 IMVs, 410 towed artillery, 600 SPGs, and various other hardware. And yet to be delivered as of now are 41 aircraft, 25 helicopters, 142 tanks, about 60 AFVs, 801 APCs, 300 MRAPs, 1,240 IMVs, 35 towed artillery, 194 SPGs, and others. I chose to highlight these numbers to show that Ukraine has received and still is receiving robust support from allies and will not run out of equipment anytime soon. I would also like to note that the vast majority of equipment is not cutting-edge Western stuff. It's usually 30 to 40 years old or even older used hardware, much of it Soviet-made. Another important thing to remember is that NATO countries are increasing their military spending massively, which will likely free up additional used hardware for Ukraine to use. So Ukraine will be reasonably well supplied for the foreseeable future, except in one area: air defense. Ukraine currently operates 8 Patriot batteries. According to Zelensky, they would need about 25. Russian ballistic missiles continue to be a severe threat against which Patriots excel. But to put that number of 25 into perspective, there are 186 Patriots in the world in total. There is also the bottleneck of missiles. Against planes, PAC-2 missiles are enough, which are also produced in Europe. However, against ballistic missiles, you need the PAC-3, which is only produced by the US at a rate of about 600 per year. And Ukraine is not the only one standing in line for them. Also, US support for Ukraine continues to be in question. For a brief period, the US halted deliveries, saying they had to review their stocks. This is at the end of a long line of anti-Ukraine sentiment, including calling Zelensky a dictator and the infamous Oval Office meeting. But just a few days ago, Trump seems to have taken a complete 180 and is now fully in support of Ukraine, apparently. This is good news, but this also means that the US can't really be relied on. After all, what if Trump changes his mind again? These shifts by the Trump admin are, in my opinion, due to three factions within and their struggles. The old hawkish neoconservatives, who are driven by geopolitical and business considerations, versus the new Christian fascist isolationist wing, who are driven by their sympathy towards Vladimir Putin and hate towards the Western quote-unquote liberal world, which Ukraine is a part of according to them. And in the middle, there is Trump, the face and legitimizing force of the administration, who just likes it when people clap at him. He wants to make deals, score quick wins, peace agreements, and so on. And the administration will generally tip towards the position he holds, which, at the moment, is pro-Ukraine. But what if Trump capitulated to the isolationists and cut off all aid permanently? Not only that, but even sales. I don't think even such a step would cause Ukraine to collapse. Ukraine also has its own production, for example of its own SPGs and IMVs, in addition to 2 million FPV drones and 2.5 million shells per year. So even if all aid ceased to Ukraine completely, it still wouldn't mean that Russia would get a free ticket for stomping Ukraine. So this is the situation we are currently at. A slow grind along the front lines, while seeing the count of casualties and destroyed hardware go up until one of the sides can no longer keep up. Aside from that, there are also potential Black Swan events, which might change the situation completely. These include Ukraine getting Taurus missiles and destroying the Kerch Bridge, for example, or some unforeseen internal conflict within Russia. The point is, things will continue on like this until they don't. So for now, the best thing we can do is to keep track of events and of course elect pro-Ukraine leaders in the West in the meantime. With that, I thank you for watching, and I'll be seeing you next time.